Barnes. I'm really thrilled today to have one of the top artists in Los Angeles and also in New York, Tony Berlant, as my guest. He's having a thing here. A new piece of his sculpture has been put up in front of Frank Gehry's new offices here in Santa Monica, and so I wanted him to be here today to talk about his career, his success, and also about his relationship with Frank Gehry. Hi, Tony.
How about my failures? Those are more colorful.
When you were just telling me the story about helping Ken Nolan actually paint a painting at an AIDS benefit, and then he introduced himself, that happened to me recently.
That's one of my failures. That's one I would never have
Recently, I ran into Eric Fischel at a party in East Hampton. I said, it's such an honor and a privilege to meet you. And he said, well, I used to sweep your floors in your gallery. And that was the same kind of thing, where you think, my God, I hope we're nice to people on their way up, because we're going to run into them sooner or later.
It's nice to be nice to people in general.
Now, tell me about you. How did you get started as an artist?
I saw a painting called Crow by Emerson Wolfer. And for some reason, that was like the key turning in the lock.
Could you just feel it in your body?
Well, it's I was just saying, like a key turning in the lock.
Yeah.
I saw this thing and it was like, ooh, wow. In a way that the Van Goghs had not done for me. And then I saw a couple of big Rothkos and a couple of big Clifford Stills. And most of all, I saw a little painting called Woman with a Green Handkerchief, which is a Guernica period Picasso.
Uh-huh.
And that was just like an overwhelming kind of emotional response that I had not expected to have, and didn't have any information or wall placards to explain why this was something. But it kind of made me realize something I'm more aware of now than ever, which is that in art you don't choose your ancestors, you recognize your ancestors.
Absolutely. I've never heard anybody say that. That's absolutely true.
They're just these
we
people,
recognize each other.
For some reason, there are these people who have a special impact on you, and you have some kind of lineage, some kind of mysterious, inexplicable connection to.
When I went to a de Kooning show at the Whitney a couple of years ago and sat there, I actually felt that I could tell the levels of people's thinking by their reactions to the de Kooning. I never heard anybody say that before, recognize each other through the art. So what happened? Did you make it a point to meet Emerson, or did you get into art school? What happened?
Many, many years ago we showed together with David Stewart, but no, I remember being in a Spanish class and somebody asked me about who Picasso was.
Yeah.
I made some reference to Picasso, and I made this drawing of this sort of synthetic cubist Picasso, and I looked at it and I was just overwhelmed with amazement that I had just made this fantastic thing.
That you had copied him?
No, it was just sort of,
no,
it was just a thing, and wow, and I made a whole bunch of them, and I was off at making art. And I do remember that from the very beginning, the first things you make like that have as much power and resonance as anything I've ever done since.
Now, did you change your life right away? Did you get a studio? Did you begin to paint? Or
no, I just started making these things, go buy some materials, start making things.
I became interested in art in the 60s, 50s, and 60s in New York as a result of a relationship with de Kooning and the abstract expressionists. I remember the most exciting thing was when I learned about figure grounding, looking at David Smith's sculpture. And suddenly I understood something about art that would carry me to another level, and it changed my thinking.
Well, this was just about the time that I was able to drive for the first time. And every 2 weeks I would go to all the shows in town.
Yeah.
So I saw all of them twice, and every work and every show was fascinating to me.
Was it important for you to know the artist, or was it
I didn't know them then
the
because I was a kid in high school.
What galleries were in existence then?
Well, there was all the usual things. I would start with, I always went to the Ferris Gallery because it was the most exciting thing to see. But Felix Landau always had wonderful things, and Esther Robles always had wonderful things, and Frank Pearls and Paul Cantor. I'd go to Beverly Hills and see their things. And the scene was so small that if you were a little boy standing intently in front of these pictures, after a while they recognized you, and they got to know you, and they'd take you in the office, and I'd come in, and Felix Landau would say, "Oh, Tony, this Giacometti sculpture just came in. I know you're in love," because it was so small.
Yeah. Did you ever buy anything?
The first thing I ever bought was a Diego Rivera lithograph from 1937 for $12.
Where'd you buy it?
I bought that in San Francisco from can't think of his name, who became the great Japanese print dealer.
How fabulous.
Yeah.
I know you have a de Kooning in your kitchen. I've always been impressed by
De Kooning
that.
in the kitchen.
Yeah.
Well, years later, I was represented by Xavier Fourcade, who was de Kooning's primary dealer. So I got to see de Kooning on close range on many occasions. And the main thing that always strikes me when I finally meet these people who are almost supernatural, or who are supernatural in my estimate, is that in person as people, they're just people. To me, the mystique isn't there in who they are as a social personality. The mystique is in their work.
Well, when he was in power or in vogue or
But
in
he
fashion,
was Bill, yeah.
it was Bill, but you all had to paint the same way in order to be accepted by the public and by the galleries.
It was very intense at that time.
There was no, somebody like Paul Cadmus or a realist just could not make it. In fact, when Rothko changed his style or when Guston changed his style, they were out for a while until the art world came around. That didn't happen here, did it?
Well, I mean, I think that abstract expressionism was the true religion.
Yeah.
And, but then of course when de Kooning started doing the women,
Yeah.
and Pollock started painting big heads,
Yeah.
and then Guston did these completely lunatic things
The Ku Klux
when they
Klan.
first did them. They really
Oh,
were,
yeah, yeah.
They were really weird. And so then that was a big crack in the scene, but definitely it was considered pathetic if you were not an abstract painter when I first came on the scene. But then very quickly, like 1959 was like the end of abstract expressions. You know, Jasper Johns and Rauschenberg and those people were just first doing work that had a different kind of reference. And so I saw that true church just collapse, and there were only a few geniuses left, and everybody else was a kind of bitter, also ran.
Now, you started as a somewhat traditional painter, going to UCLA and
It wasn't that traditional.
Never?
No, well, I started doing Rauschenberg-inspired kinds of collage combine things in high school.
And
I
when did
studied
you
with
become a
Diebenkorn
sculptor?
first.
Did you really?
Yeah, he was my teacher for beginning painting, which was wonderful luck. So I painted kind of Diebenkorn-like
What was he
things.
like?
He was just a wonderful man, just a wonderful person.
Did you seek him out? You've always had luck with finding...
Well, I knew in high school, I had looked with a magnifying glass on an article about him in Horizon magazine. I remember like looking around the studio with a magnifying glass.
Yeah.
Thinking how great it would be to be able to go in this room and make these things. So he was teaching at UCLA as a visiting serious artist, which they would have once a year. And Bill Bryce got me in the class, even though I didn't have the prerequisites. And that was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And Dick became a close friend as years went by.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
I don't think many people realize that Bill Bryce was Fanny Bryce's son.
I know.
Isn't that amazing?
He came from an incredibly sophisticated background. Marsden Hartley used to give him painting lessons.
You're kidding.
No.
I just saw a Marsden Hartley show at the Whitney that was just extraordinary. Yeah. They were huge wall murals. You've just done a wall mural for Target.
Right.
What was that like?
That was wonderful. It's a 10 by 60 foot piece, and I had been wanting to do, I had been in Bruges, and every morning I would go and look at this Bosch painting, which was only about 4 by 3 feet. And yet every day it was a different painting. It was so filled with different ways to look at it. You know, and I was so involved with that, and I remember walking along this canal and thinking, I'd like to make something that was a kind of a hybrid between this Bosch and between Chinese scroll painting, where you walk by a thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when this opportunity came along, I was all primed to make some big, long thing, and they were just absolutely wonderful to work with and gave me total freedom. I didn't have to make a preliminary drawing or maquette or anything. I just told them it would be a highly subjective. Yeah, I told them it would be a highly subjective vision of the Minneapolis, Minnesota landscape, which is what it was.
There are so many artists who do that kind of serial imagery. Joe DiGiorgio did a vignette of what's a place in Arizona where you look down?
The Grand Canyon.
Yeah, the Grand Canyon.
That's
and
the
all
big
the
hole, yeah.
the big hole. And so many people now are doing the history of art in kind of serial imagery. You know, one long painting. When did you become a sculptor?
Well, I don't know that I don't really think of myself as so much as a sculptor.
You don't really?
No, I've made a few things that are sculptures, but mainly they're things that are painted on different planes. But I think I've always thought more kind of, I'm stumbling around here because really the moment that I became serious about art was a moment when people were interested in sort of getting in this place where they were object makers. They weren't painters, they weren't sculptors.
For example?
So you had Chamberlain making color dimensional things, which is almost like taking a big piece of de Kooning and twisting it in space.
Exactly, yeah.
And Cornell was making these objects which had a huge influence on me because they seemed to me to be outside of normal art world values and be something made out of deep personal need rather than to fit into the competitive scheme, you know, like being an NBA basketball player. It was somebody who, all the rules were your own rules and the successes were your own successes. And people like Louise Nevelson, who I never hear anybody talk about anymore, she had a big influence on me. All these people were like you would, almost like the way a shaman would find a spirit guide, an artist would find some particular material, which was their magic passport into themselves.
That's funny. Everybody's talking about Lee Bonacu now, and she has a traveling exhibit.
Sure.
But Louise Nevelson will be back. I think people go in cycles, and I think she'll be back really strongly.
Well, Bonacu was I mean, I think she was, everyone I know would occasionally mention Bonacu and think about her because she was one of those people who was so powerful, and then where did she go? You know, and occasionally I would see the pieces here and there, and they
didn't she have a sort of a breakdown and leave the art world for a couple
I don't know
years?
what that was about. Some people just, the art world's a very nasty, desperate
It is.
place.
It's terrifying,
It's a very
yet we
terrible
can't get
place.
away from it. We're addicted.
Well, I'm not so addicted to the art world. I'm addicted to making art, to the fellowship of artists who I'm close to. But the art world itself is such a, there's just not enough to go around.
Not enough.
Not enough attention
Yeah.
to go around, so it gets kind of desperate and competitive. But the making of art is beautiful. And
Well, so tell me how you create. You do, for example, the boxes or things out of, are they tin?
they're steel. I mean, but all thin metal we call tin generically.
Right. And how did you come about that? How did you begin to use steel?
I was making these collages in which I used all kinds of mixed materials, and sometimes it was found pieces of metal. And then there was a little market across the street from my studio in Venice that was being knocked down, and I went over and collected all the signs, Walker Evans-esque collection of advertising signs, and started cutting those up, and that's how I got into that material.
So you have a real debt to older artists, for example, mentioning Walker Evans and his photographs.
I have a debt to everything I've ever responded to intensely. Now the things that I'm the most involved with collecting are early man tools, the oldest artifacts ever made, the artifacts that predate who we are as a species, the things made by Homo erectus and the Neanderthals and archaic human beings, so things that go back 2 million years. So I think anything you love then imprints you in a way, whether it's Lincoln, the bizarreness of Lincoln Boulevard, or the sublime beauty of the Pacific Ocean.
Did you know Helmut Newton? I'm not Helmut Newton. Who was the photographer that did all the artists then and now? He did the famous Pollock pictures under plastic.
I didn't know him. I knew Helmut Newton very slightly.
Well, the man I'm trying to think of, he actually collected antique tools and photographed them, and it was just amazing. Really great. So
I like those.
Yeah, yeah. Well, now for a while you were actually doing selling Navajo rugs. What was that?
I've always been interested in collecting things, and in the late 60s, when I was teaching at UCLA, I discovered the weavings that the Navajos had worn, blankets that they wore before they started making things commercially, before they had been defeated as an independent culture. And I was just thunderstruck by those and started collecting those. And Donald Judd visited me one day, and I was complaining about teaching at the time and how I was afraid of losing this job, but I hated it.
At UCLA?
Yeah, at UCLA. And he suggested, he was interested in blankets already, and he suggested I should come to New York and stay with him, and that artists would be interested in collecting these things. And so I spent a period of time looking for those things, dealing in them as a way of collecting, was also a great way of getting to have contact with all these people in New York. And that's been my history until maybe the last decade, when I essentially could just live for my work, was to deal in things that I was collecting.
Did having
I mean,
a
the
child...
best dealers are always collectors who can't stop buying.
That's exactly,
I mean,
that's me, yeah.
That's kind of a cliche, but it's true.
Yeah, I was late today because I was out looking
Sure.
at things to buy.
And there's always some new thing, and for me, the pleasure of seeing something and being overwhelmed with a desire to know more about it and experience it. It's something that's not yet known. And then the pleasure of show and tell, of presenting these things to people.
Absolutely.
Is a kick, is a big kick.
Who are some of your favorite artists?
Well, yesterday I was reading an article in the New York Times about Seurat, and I didn't realize he died when he was 33 years old.
I had no idea.
Which I just can't believe. And I've never liked his paintings because I've always found them so compulsive and kind of mechanical, but the drawings, these dark drawings, just fill me with awe. I keep a book on Seurat's drawings open at my house, and every few days I turn a page.
Do you really?
And just have a different page there so I can look at it. So all the regular famous people I love, and all the people who almost nobody else knows about.
For example?
Well, I was thinking about Ed Carrillo when I was driving over here. Did you know who Ed Carrillo was?
Oh, sure. He's been on the show.
Well, yeah. Well, he died maybe 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But he's somebody who's, in retrospect, when I think about it, I have a big painting of Ed's that I could look at and say that my work that happened like 15 or 20 years later could all be linked back to this 4x6 foot painting that was in my living room for a very long time.
I think Charles Garabidia was
that.
influenced by him, too.
Well, and I was certainly, I mean, yeah, but then Chaz influenced all of us.
Really?
Enormously. Oh, yeah. And in fact, I told Chaz once how much he influenced me, and he came back with telling me all the ways I've influenced him.
That's great. Well, Ed Carrillo, didn't he have a cousin that painted baseball players?
Not a cousin, Lance Richbourg.
Yeah.
Who was by marriage, who married the sister of the girl who the Goldberg girls.
So there's always that synergism, don't you think, in the art world? Did you come from an art background? Were either of your parents artists or filmmakers? Or?
No, but my dad had been a set designer when he was very young.
I didn't know that. Where?
The New World Theater in New York. And my mom met my dad because he was doing the sets as the assistant to Morning Becomes Electra, the O'Neill play. And,
sure. Who was the designer on
a man named Gorelick. My
Yeah.
dad was his assistant, and my mom wanted to meet O'Neill, and they went to the Automat together. And so I came out of my dad became a kind of self-taught scientist, inventor, but being an artist was always something that they saw as a kind of an ideal. So I didn't have to rebel at all. They thought this was
Yeah,
a
and they
wonderful
really
thing.
encouraged
They
you.
were
Did your
very
mother
encouraging.
take you to art classes when
No.
you were? But they were always really excited about
You can be anything you want to be as long as you're a college professor. That's what she always said.
Were you an only child
No, I have a brother who's a psychiatrist internist
here in Los Angeles?
in Boise, Idaho.
Really? Do you look alike?
He's a very thin version of me, but we look fairly similar. We have almost identical voices, which is interesting.
Now, what are you doing now? Tell me about the Frank Gehry project.
This isn't a public show, and it'll be over with by the time this airs, I think, but I made these big sculptures, 1966 to
Oh, and they were in the
68.
Whitney at one
They were at the
point.
Whitney
You
in
had a
73,
show there.
right, and they've been in storage all this time, and I had just resurrected them and cleaned them up, and I had lunch with Frank and showed him these pictures, and he invited me to show them in his space, and it's been great having them there. So they've been there for a couple of months.
He's one of the few architects that I know that really relies on artists for inspiration.
Well, he was a fellow traveler. Is that the right word? No, that's back to the Comedy Theater. But he was he was part of that scene. I mean, he was one of the few people who really took us all seriously in the early 60s. And as Frank recently pointed out to me, living and interacting with artists, it opened up possibilities for architecture that was not in his formal training and background.
Yeah.
You know, using different kinds of materials, and I think being much more impulsive and much
And
more
whimsical and
playful and
fanciful,
whimsical.
yeah.
So our group was a kind of catalyst for Frank to achieve fantastic things, and I'm
Who were some of the group? Who, for
well,
people
I
who don't
think
know the
I don't want to
LAC?
leave any particular person out, but certainly Ed Moses and Ken Price and Billy Al Bankston.
Bob Graham,
And
was
myself.
he a part of
Bob
that?
came a little bit. Bob is very close with Frank, but Bob wasn't here in the very early days. Later, he became very close to Frank. But Frank was also aware of Chris Burden, and he was aware of. He told me recently, I didn't realize he went to Dick Devencorn's studio a lot, and he was close
Really?
with Sam. The influences don't have to necessarily be direct, formal lines that you can draw, but it was just a kind of openness and adventuresomeness, and not always turning to the client for approval in advance. Although when I told Frank that recently, he said that his interaction with the client was much more important than he thought I understood.
Really?
That it does come out of the client and himself and impulses. But I'm just struck by the way he's used his enormous success as a vehicle to be more adventuresome and to keep doing new things, where often people kind of get frozen into their persona, their inventions become mannerisms, but not Frank.
What do you think he will do next?
I don't know, but I'm excited
Just
to see.
keep growing.
I'm
Do you
excited
think
to
that
see
you
it.
have to go to New York for a while to make it in the art world?
Well, I mean, if in careerist sense, it certainly is
Yeah.
a big, big advantage to be in New York, of course.
Why?
Well, because just Homo sapiens sapiens tend to be kind to people they know. It's not some kind of conspiracy to ignore us, but the people who you've come up with, the people you went to school with, the people you had as lovers, the people you've eaten and drank with, the people whose studios you hung around in. It's our nature, our biological nature to, besides just our intellectual nature, to appreciate them. And since that's where all of this process of validation and exhibition and collecting happens, the West Coast has been not the high-powered place to be. But most of the people I know, we've been able to live and have freedom to make our art, and I can rationalize that we haven't had to put a lot of time into doing all of the kind of social demands that we've had more freedom in a certain way. But I had a loft in New York for years.
Where was it?
At Broome and Green Street. And I spent all through from the late 60s through the early 80s, I spent 3 or 4 months a year in New York.
What did you feel the difference was between the two?
Well, that art is a real central activity in New York.
That's it, yeah.
Yeah.
Here in Los Angeles, the movie stars and television stars are revered, whereas in New York you find the artists. Los Angeles, the movie stars and television stars are revered, whereas in New York you find the artists.
Well, it's a strong European cultural
Yeah.
connection. That's what I always thought had a lot to do with it.
And where do you think you'll be in the next 5 years?
I have no idea. I have no idea. It is a kind of puzzle to me that everybody I know is still all fired up. It's not just that we're still working. We all have this big sense of energy and expectation and what I call the old prospector's syndrome, which just over the next hill, maybe if I go down in the bottom of this gully, I'm going to suddenly, something's going to open up. And
Does
great
having a
things are ahead.
child change your idea of what you want to do?
Well, it made me not want to be bi-coastal and be zipping back and forth from LA
Yeah.
to New York, but and my child is now 17 and driving
And so
and
you're
a young adult.
so you have a good life.
Yes, I do. I've been very lucky. My wife, Helen Mendez, was, to repeat the cliche, but in my case it's real.